So my name is Philipp Haueis. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Bielefeld, where Steffen, who is my colleague and actually also office colleague, office mate, is also working. And I work mainly on philosophy of neuroscience, but also philosophy of climate science, and in general philosophy of science on scientific concepts. Together is joining me today Rose Novick, who is an assistant professor at the University of Washington in Seattle, and her main focus is philosophy of biology, particularly the concept of homology, but also the concept of species, amongst other things, such as the relationship between structure and function in biology and biological thinking. And we also have Ingo Brigandt, who is a Canada Research Chair at the University of Alberta. And also his main focus is on philosophy of biology and also on scientific concepts, specifically the concept of gene, but also homology and many others, species and so on. Lately, he's also becoming more interested in conceptual engineering, specifically gender and race concepts, which you've also published on. Welcome, everyone. So what we would like to present to you today is a debate that we've ourselves participated in, and that is the debate roughly we want to call about conceptual complexity in science, which you could, and this is all just sort of for illustration, which you could view as arising when scientists usually introduce a novel concept. That could be either by introducing it in a local investigative context. So for instance, the concept of gene was first introduced to characterize and explain inheritance patterns across generations at the level of organisms. Or it could be that you introduce a concept globally, that for an entire domain you have a certain use, such as temperature, for instance, in physics. But then what often happens when research goes on is that researchers extend a concept to novel circumstances, right? So that could be either by extending a locally introduced concept to another phenomenon. So for instance, in the case of gene, scientists extended the concept from explaining inheritance patterns across generations to explaining how proteins are being produced in the body, and to characterize protein synthesis, right? That genes are responsible or part of that mechanism. And so that's a novel phenomenon, of course, like the phenomenon of protein synthesis is just a different phenomenon than the phenomenon of inheritance across generations, but that is these phenomena are also linked. Or it could be that a global use is differentiated in multiple local uses, right? So for instance, in the case of temperature, some of you may know that there's sort of this definition of temperature in terms of the kinetic energy between molecules. That works pretty well for gases, but it works less well for solids, where you don't really have an equilibrium of kinetic energy at the level of molecules. You have to go to other scales to find something stable that is related to changes in temperature. So once researchers sort of extend that definition, they actually change the definition to characterize higher order stability phenomena, such as the frozen order in polymer chains. So then you have basically formally one a global use is differentiating in multiple uses. In both cases, what's the result? The result is that you have multiple uses in a research community of a concept, and And that's what we basically mean when we talk about conceptual complexity in science. So that's sort of the problem or the phenomenon, right? That these positions or theories that we now want to talk about, or that mainly Rose and Ingo want to talk about, and I will ask them some questions about it, is supposed to sort of be a response to. So with that, I hand over to Ingo, right? You're going next? No, Rose, sorry. Yeah, the other way around. So Rose is going to present next on the first position, which is pluralism.
I'll talk about eliminativism.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right.
Okay, we first talk about eliminativism, then we talk about pluralism. My apologies, and Rose is going to start. Sorry, I mixed it all up.
Yeah, so I find it helpful to think about these in terms of both descriptive and normative claims. So the basic sort of problem here that each of the three positions is going to be responding to is just, what do you do about conceptual complexity in the sciences when you find it? People get really worried about it. And I think actually eliminativists and pluralists in different ways, and I'll talk more about this a bit later, get worried about it because they think quite plausibly that anytime you've got some form of complexity, multiple overlapping but non-identical uses, or any sort of imprecision or vagueness in what you're trying to do, then there's potential for confusion, there's potential for crosstalk, and various sorts of issues. And so then I think each of the positions starts with certain like descriptive claims about what the like shape of the complexity is, what it looks like, and then normative claims about what to do about it. So in the case of eliminativism, as Philipp said, you wind up with some concept with multiple extant uses, and the eliminativist says, well, they're distinct. They have a different reference or different theoretical definitions, and they're distinct in ways that they have no shared core meaning. You can't strip back from the particular different uses to find some shared core that unifies all of them. And so Maschery, prominently in the case of psychology, right, talks about this with the notion of concept, right? And he says, well, look, there are distinct sort of mental entities, prototypes, exemplars, and theories, and they're just different things, and we call them all concepts. And we're then the sort of third descriptive claim is this claim that we are in fact getting ourselves confused by it. And this is not yet meant to be a normative judgment. This is meant to just be like, look, people are using a term in one meaning and other people are interpreting it in another meaning because they have these dominant meanings in their head. So what do you do about this? Well, the eliminativist says, as the name suggests, eliminate the concept, replace it with a bunch of more specific concepts. So replace concept with prototype, exemplar, and theory. And just like stop all having the shared term, all sort of grouping them together is creating opportunities for confusion. There's not much benefit there. And so you should fragment it. Ereshefsky argues the same thing for species. There's a biological species concept. There's an ecological species concept. There's a phylogenetic species concept. They're all different. They apply differently to the same cases. They have different uses. Stop trying to talk about species. Stop trying to ask meaningless questions like, are there more bacterial or animal species? It's not a meaningful question. Just replace the concepts with more specific concepts. And someone like Mashri or Ereshevsky is just arguing in the particular case. More recently, we've gotten some sort of meta level, like when exactly do you fragment type of things, but with the presumption that it's sort of the go-to move. And I think with that, I've
Actually,
said
before we move on, I want to also give Ingo a chance if you feel like you wanted to add something about your take on eliminativism. I mean, we have a bit time to
follow up on the last point that Rose made. Yeah. So if you kind of look at the development of the literature, at least of originally kind of most eliminative moves were sort of made based on philosophy of science looking at kind of one very specific concrete case, like concept in psychology, species in biology, without really pondering whether the same argumentative strategy that you here see on the slide as a general overarching strategy, whether it should apply to other cases as well. This holds even for Mark Ereshevsky, who uses terms like pluralism, eliminativism, that is his position, and pluralism and eliminativism are, for their kind of more general categories. But only kind of more recently has there been a sort of meta debate. I guess that also kind of mimics what we've seen in conceptual engineering, some conceptual engineering discussions about kind of one concrete concept, how to engineer it, other are kind of meta discussions of how to do conceptual engineering, what are concept functions. And I guess what we're doing here is kind of something of the kind of latter type, where we kind of really contrast eliminativism, pluralism, and neutralism as of different visions you can take on concepts.
Yeah, and maybe to add to that, so one paper that has this sort of more general outlook is Taylor and Vickers on conceptual fragmentation and the rise of eliminativism in EJPS, and there they kind of argue more generally about this point and say what they propose two heuristics. So when should we sort of when should we eliminate a concept, and it's when it plays multiple roles. So they talk about theoretical roles, right? And then because that would lead to scientists often defining the concept in various ways, and if sort of arguments rely in their conclusions or in their premises on the concept, and then that gives rise to equivocation, right? That like people tend to misunderstand the arguments because they will substitute without paying attention one meaning for the other, and then people talk past each other in these debates. So it's probably better to just have not have the same term but different terms to avoid this. Also, maybe one last thing to mention here: eliminativism, for those of you familiar with philosophy of mind, is not here meant to be like a metaphysical claim, right? So nobody says their concepts do not exist, or in the mind, like if Mashri says eliminate concept from psychology, because he thinks that prototypes, exemplars, and theories exist. He just thinks they're different kinds. So it's different from somebody like Paul Churchland, who says like beliefs don't exist, by which he means like no token, like there's no token that is actually belief in the world, right? And so here it's really just about the taxonomy and taxonomic revision, rather than about the most of the time, at least, about the ontology. I mean, again, there's probably also like room for further work on this, because I think sometimes the sort of arguments also get a bit muddled up because of the use of the term eliminativism. There's a paper by Will Ramsey in Synthese about exactly this problem, that eliminativism has the ambiguity between let's say taxonomic eliminativism and ontological eliminativism. Okay, so I think with that we know a little bit about eliminativism, so let's move on to the next position, which is pluralism. So Ingo, if you want to take over from here.
Yes, and so we are following the same plot. First, some sort of more descriptive observations, and then moving on to the kind of crucial normative consideration, taking a quite different line than eliminativism. So the descriptive prong starts out with noting that the concept C has multiple extant uses, different species definitions. These uses are distinct in reference, theoretical definition. They have no shared core meaning. For instance, different species concept, if you use one rather than another one, it may kind of delineate species boundaries, which organisms belong to a species, how many species there are in the habitat in a different fashion. So far, the descriptive prong is sort of just identical to what we had on the eliminativism slide, but there, one additional observation was that, look, if you have different meanings, different sub-concepts that can create confusion, now the kind of pluralist may point to another kind of observation or consideration that options often obtains, namely kind of to note that these various sub-concepts are relevant in the same field. And that already kind of diverges from the eliminativist vision insofar as if it at least it makes eliminativism less easy in practice to pull off, because let's assume it was the case that different concepts, sub-concepts are used in different, completely different scientific concepts. For instance, the ecological species is only used by ecologists in ecology. The evolutionary species concept is instead is used by evolutionary biologists in a different field. Then it's sort of easy to see that, look, different people, different disciplines, they're already doing their thing. That works. Why do we need a concept of species? We can just do easily without it. However, as it turns out, several species concepts can be relevant to the same field, and they may be even used by the same scientists. For instance, Justin Psovi had made the case of looking at yeast, looking at microbiologists investigating yeast, that they actually jointly use several species concepts, sometimes in a kind of sequential fashion, where they kind of may start out with an ecological species concept, distinguishing different strains of yeast by sort of what their hosts are, but then they kind of often realize we need additional information. If it's, for instance, if it's a sexually reproducing a kind of yeast, they may then go on to introduce a biological species concept, and sometimes it's also often relevant to try to kind of get more fine-grained by seeing what the genetic or phylogenetic species concept would say about the same case. And of course, if it's the same scientist, the same research group using several species concepts, it's all clear, well, they don't get confused by it. So it seems to work fine for the scientists, or at least all that makes of eliminativism less of a kind of, or the kind of plurality less of a kind of threat to communication than eliminativists may kind of make it out. Be it as it may, let's move on to the important normative part, because if you simply note, look, people can get along with it, there's no kind of serious miscommunication, you have shown that, well, it's not really kind of necessary to eliminate, but why should we be actively being pluralist, at least in certain cases? And here the idea is that we should still kind of retain the kind of original overarching concept, like the overarching concept of species. It should be retained because having this concept still plays an important role within science. Namely, it matters can matter for introducing new sub-concepts and then subsequently refining them and deciding should we actually retain these sub-concepts or not. And a good example of this is Henry Taylor's work on the concept of attention in psychology. In a nutshell, there's a clear instance of plurality. There are different concepts of or different definitions of attention. Just to give you a sense, is sort of some of them presuppose that a person has to be consciously aware of something for it to count as attention. But there are other definitions of attention that don't presuppose any conscious awareness of something. For instance, you may have a lot of experimental studies where the experimenter asks people to kind of visually focus on one thing in the picture or focus on something else. And then the picture changes, and focusing on one as opposed to the other thing makes then the difference on the new picture, whether people are kind of actually notice something or kind of notices it much faster. So which shows, even though it's not consciously, there's no kind of, they are not consciously aware of it, if they kind of focus, it makes a difference. So in this sense, they've been paying attention. There's of intention involved, even though it's quite different than other types of attention. Now, Henry Taylor, on his account, attention, the general concept, is what he calls a general reasoning strategy, a concept, and he uses that notion from Philipp, general reason strategy. And on his account, these general reasoning strategies, they can be tacit, and one role they play is they kind of guide scientists for developing experimental procedures, experimental paradigms that scientists then use to kind of try to kind of investigate the phenomena, a certain type of attention. And so in this sense, the general reasoning strategy matters for introducing experimental strategies, and then subsequently trying to get clear on if this research or this promising what is actually the kind of what's the specific sub-concept of attention that this research with these experimental strategies is getting at. And then so subsequently, of course, kind of once research proceeds, we can refine this definition of attention, and also kind of decide, is it worth retaining this notion of attention, or does the research of actually show, well, there's not really kind of a phenomenon there. And to kind of just flesh this out a little bit, Henry Taylor argues that of one aspect or one component of this general reason strategy, attention, is the idea of cognitively selecting some kinds of information. And it's important for him to kind of clarify that this selection business isn't just another definition of attention, a new kind of subconcept, because there have been others in the philosophy of cognitive science literature who have put forward their own kind of new pet definition of attention, saying attention is defined as in terms of selection. So these people are actually kind of introducing a new sub-concept, let's say C5, attention 5, and actually arguing, look, this is also, so much better than previous proposed definitions, which actually be kind of monist. Henry Taylor is a clear pluralist, and he's adamant that the way in which kind of selection is part of his account is not as part of the definition, a kind of new sub-concept, but it is one aspect of the general reasoning strategy of attention that scientists then use to develop experimental paradigms and then formulating new sub-concepts. A second way in which a sort of general concept matters is that it helps us understand the relation between the different sub-concepts and how to kind of navigate between them. A good case in point are different concepts of race and gender. People have, there's clearly been a plurality of race and gender concepts, and at least more recently in the conceptual engineering literature, it has been argued, look, we need more than one concept of race and gender. And occasionally there's also been attention to how to kind of really understand the relation between them and navigate between them. One example is a paper or a chapter by me and Esther Rosario, where in a nutshell we argue, look, we need different concepts of gender. That's our focus in the paper, for different purposes, some of which may be kind of social purposes, and so we can make sense of gender talk by kind of getting clear of, okay, why are we invoking a certain concept of gender? If it's in this concept, we need a specific concept of gender, and for this reason, the overall arching concept of gender helps us sort of navigate between them. A related example would be Catherine Jenkins' recent book, Ontology and Oppression. I think that's the title. So she's not doing conceptual engineering or talking primarily in terms of concepts. Instead, given that she's sort of doing ontology, she's sort of talking in terms of different categories, but she's clearly first a pluralist about race and gender. Race and gender are different kinds of things on her account. She offers these accounts, but she also devotes considerable attention to kind of how do we understand the relation between these different categories about them. And to my mind, that sort of shows that she deploys sort of a notion of an overarching notion, concept of race and gender to do this task. One final remark. I think this sort of move that an overarching concept plays a role. I mean, it aligns certainly also kind of with kind of recent discussions about that you see in conceptual engineering that you say, look, at least of some conceptual engineers take the line that concepts are tools they use for different practical, pragmatic purpose, or kind of that they are kind of concept functions, and we use concept for a certain function or purpose. And the other, so that's clearly one alignment. And the other thing that this shows off, certainly Henry Taylor's idea of a general reasoning strategy, is that there can be more to concepts, scientific and other concepts, than just sort of definitions that would sort of help us sort of pick out a certain reference. Because for Taylor, attention is a general reasoning strategy, includes the idea of selection, but the selection doesn't function there as a definition. Instead, it's a general reasoning strategy that helps scientists to kind of develop experimental paradigms and try to kind of pin down particular sub-concepts or definitions of. And so if one, I guess the eliminativist looks good if you kind of reduce what concepts may involve to kind of definitions, because then you see different definitions, and that can create a confusion. But if you kind of take into other features into account, like kind of concepts playing a certain function in terms of general reasoning strategy, you can actually see how this concept do some work and be sort of productive, and then not yield an argument for pluralism.
All right. Thanks so much. I want to add one thing, and then I'll just hand over to Rose, because I think she will say more about both positions when she will introduce neutralism. Just to clarify, the last thing you said about definitions, some eliminativists, for instance, Taylor and Vickers, and yes, that's the same Henry Taylor that is now a pluralist in the attention paper, who wrote this paper on selective eliminativism 6 years ago. Just FYI. But they agree, or at least they have a very pragmatist view of definitions, right? They say a definition does not provide necessary and sufficient conditions for application. A definition is always introduced with an intended use. And in science, that's often the kind of theoretical role the concept is supposed to play, right? But like, because they tie it in this way, of course, it's like for every theoretical role, you kind of have one subconcept, where a subconcept is like that definition and the sort of use in research, right? And so then, of course, you get this idea that, oh, you have multiple theoretical roles associated with the same concept, and you have different subconcepts fulfilling these roles, and that can create confusion because people don't know which concept you kind of have in mind when you just use the same term. And then I think some of the pluralists, including myself, have argued that, well, although sometimes that seems to be the case, other times you use multiple subconcepts to contribute to the same role or to the same goal, right? So like sometimes you, I don't know, combine, for instance, in cognitive neuroscience, attention as conscious awareness and attention as visual focus in explanations of a certain behavior that people show in an experiment. So in that case, it's not that each subconcept just is just associated with its distinct role. It could also be the case. But the reason why I'm stressing this is it shouldn't sound as if some eliminativists do not acknowledge that scientific concepts have a more complex structure than just consisting of definitions. They do acknowledge what Ingo has called epistemic goals. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Rose, who will introduce the last position that we want to present you. Okay, and I have to do this, right? Here you go.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. Yeah, so I want to start by thinking a little bit about what the eliminativists and the pluralists have in common. Both the eliminativists and the pluralists are addressing this problem. What do we do about this global conceptual complexity? We've got this range of local uses. They're distinct in important ways. There's total agreement there. So what do we do about the total complexity? And the way that this debate gets cashed out, and you saw it in what I said and what Ingo said earlier, is in terms of, well, like, let's weigh the harms on one side and the benefits on the other. The eliminativists get really worried about confusion and crosstalk. The pluralists, as Ingo highlighted, make these claims about sort of other kinds of uses that the eliminativists are not seeing that justify it. And the arguments and the way these arguments go in pluralist papers is not to deny that confusion happens, but to say that it's outweighed by these other things. And so there's this question of, like, what is complexity good for? And there's a shared presupposition that, like, if we're going to tolerate it, it must be good for something. The neutralist position, sort of most simply, and I'll get more complex in a minute, but the neutralist position most simply is that there actually isn't a problem here that we should be so worried about. And I think it's helpful to consider an analogy here. So if you think about an onion, not just the, like, edible bulb that you might use when cooking, but the entire plant. The haploid genome size of an onion is 15.9 gigabases. And if you think then about a human has a haploid genome size of 3.1 gigabases. So an onion has 5 times as much DNA as a human does. And you might ask why? Why, sort of at the genetic level, is an onion so bloated, so complex? Sorry, there's a siren outside my window, and I'm not going to be able to think until it's passed. Why does the onion have so much DNA? And people will try to answer questions like this, right? Maybe the onion's doing something with it, although it's not really sort of clear that an onion is a more complex organism than a human. sometimes you'll get explanations in terms like, well, look, if empirically, if you have lots of DNA in your cells, cell growth and cell division happens less frequently, just because every time you divide a cell, you've got to copy all that DNA. Takes a lot long, takes 5 times as long, right, for an onion. It's for a human. So you can slow down cell division and cell growth. Maybe that's useful or something. But the much more plausible answer is there's no particular reason from the onion's perspective why it has more DNA than a human. It's just a bunch of junk. It's just a bunch of bloat. And if you're asking, like, what's the onion doing with all this DNA? You're asking the wrong question. You're not going to understand why it got there. And even if you find uses for it, right? Maybe the onion does do something with its slower cell growth, but that doesn't mean the DNA is there, like it accumulated DNA to slow down its cell growth, but well, it accumulated a bunch of DNA, now its cell growth is slower, make some use of that. The thought that the neutralist has is that the complexity of scientific concepts is like that. And so one of the reasons why onions have so much DNA is they've got a bunch of these what are called transposable elements that sort of replicate themselves in the genome, right? Make lots of copies of themselves, serve their own benefit. And as long as they're not killing the onion, they sort of get to stick around. Humans have fewer of them, sort of accidental. It's nothing special about us particularly that we'd have fewer. In the same, and so if you ask about the onion's interests, you're not going to see things rightly. If you ask about the local interests of particular DNA stretches, you will. And there's supposed to be an analogy here with concepts, that the way that this complexity is formed. So now we're getting into the descriptive claims, right? We've got this complexity, we've got these uses. How did they form? Well, they formed predominantly under local pressures, right? One group of people, one community trying to solve their particular problems, right? Adapting a resource that they found to that problem without concern for global structure, right? And so then the complexity emerges as a byproduct of a bunch of these different communities. And both the processes that Philipp talked about at the start, where you get one local use of gene, and then, right, you start using it in a new area, it looks like it's sufficiently similar, and then you get this, you discover the complexity later. That looks to me like a neutral process at the global level. Same thing if you've got something like temperature, and so now everybody's got temperature to use, and then you start using it in different areas, and again, there's just complexity there that you've got to deal with locally. But it's sort of it's an artifact, right, of it's historically contingent. It's a bit path dependent. And so the descriptive thought here is that global complexity is a byproduct of these sorts of processes, and any functionality it shows is sort of post hoc. Well, it's there, so you deal with it, just as you deal with the confusion. Normatively, then, the claim is going to be, right, in contrast to this sort of presupposition that I think the eliminativists and the pluralists share, that we need to have some story about its sort of overall usefulness for the pluralist, or hazardousness for the eliminativist. The neutralist wants to make the normative claim that on the whole, this global complexity is neither beneficial nor harmful. And when I wrote the paper introducing this, I was a bit cagey about this. I think this is a plausible hypothesis. I don't actually think I would assert it confidently that that's true. I think it's plausibly true, but I don't think I can assert it. What I really think is that the arguments of both eliminativists and pluralists are underpowered to actually convincingly establish the weight of the full set of trade-offs. I think that's actually just a really difficult problem. And so we should at least be considering that, like, maybe it's all neutral. I don't think we've generally ruled that out. And then furthermore, right, you do occasionally see cases of conceptual housekeeping. Philipp and I have talked about this in a paper that will come out sometime, edited volumes being what they are. But the paper is available in advance. You do see cases of conceptual housekeeping that succeed, where you clean up some of this complexity. But even these are generally only local. Even these are like two uses have like come to interact in the same domain in a harmful way. And in that domain where there's that conflict, if it gets bad enough, and the confusion gets bad enough, right, then the people in that community might kick it out. Looking at the time, I'm not going to give the detailed case of that, but if it comes up in Q&A, I have a nice little case that illustrates that with the notion of sequence homology. But I think that that's sort of basically what neutralism is, that there's not actually as much of a problem here as we thought. And I have some preliminary thoughts about what this might mean for conceptual engineering, but certainly not developed ones. And so I think I'll let that come out in the Q&A. But I'm very interested in, if you find this plausible, what you think it means for the kinds of things that you're up to. And I think I can end it there.
All right, thanks, Rose. Looking at the time, maybe we're already over what we what we promised. So maybe I'm not gonna do like another round where we all say how we think that relates to conceptual engineering. Personally, we just wanted to present to you these positions and then really just get a discussion going where you think this is interesting to, I mean, you being more the experts on conceptual engineering. So we kind of just wanted to give you some insight into the debate as it currently stands in philosophy of science with the major positions. So maybe just thanks already so far to Ingo and Rose for presenting both your thoughts, but also overviewing canvassing the debate. And thanks a lot.